Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Baltimore. I'm Tim Sellers, the Wilson H. Elkins Professor of the University System of Maryland. And the greatest honor and privilege of being the Wilson H. Elkins Professor is that I am therefore empowered to select and invite a distinguished scholar whom I hold in the highest regard to deliver the Wilson H. Elkins Lecture. And this year's Elkins Lecturer will be Professor Philip Pettit. Before I introduce Professor Pettit, I want to recognize several people who are in the room. Dean Ronald Weish. Dean Weish is the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, and he played a leading role in bringing the Elkins Lecturer to the University of Baltimore. So we thank you, Dean Weish. Professor Frank Lovett of Washington University, who is the co-organizer of the Republicanism Symposium, of which this is the inaugural event. And Ms. Ellen Pruitt, who has done all the work to make this gathering possible. And it's good for you to know her because she is the one who will save any disasters that may happen in the course of this gathering. So thank you very much, Ellen Pruitt. But above all, I want to welcome Professor Philip Pettit. Professor Pettit is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton University and Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University in Canberra. Professor Pettit has so many honors and excellent publications that it would be tedious to begin to list them. But for me and for this gathering on republicanism, his excellent book, Republicanism, published in 1997, is an inspiration in our field and has been an inspiration to me personally. This is the 25th anniversary of that publication, and also the 25th anniversary, I think, of the last time I saw Professor Pettit in Baltimore. So welcome back to Baltimore, Professor Pettit. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Tim. Well, it is really a great honor to be asked to do the inaugural event of this symposium. There are many who might have been asked. I mean, it seemed to be a spate of interest in the 90s, the late 90s, in Republican theory, rethinking Republican theory. There are many others who might have opened this, apart from me. There's Richard Dagger, who's that Quentin Skinner, of course, but who will be speaking tomorrow morning, although virtually, alas. And indeed, there's Tim Sellers himself. In any case, it's a great honor. Thank you very much. And thank you for that nice introduction, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to talk about freedom in the Republic, and I'm going to try to keep it to 40, 45 minutes so we can have a bit of time for discussion afterwards. So the topic is obviously social freedom. I think that's always worth saying, isn't it? As distinct from metaphysical freedom about free will or whatever, as distinct from ethical or psychological freedom, the sort of freedom we talk about when we say that someone is weak of will and where they're free when they are strong of will, as it were. That's not our topic. It's social freedom. And social freedom in that sense, I think of, is a freedom that's predicated of three quite different sorts of subjects, so to speak. There are free choices, there are free persons, and there are free societies, or free states in the traditional phrase. And I think it's very important that we address all three, and all three are implicated in the broad swathe of Republican or neo-Republican thinking. So I'm first going to talk about free choices, and then go on to free persons, and then to free societies, and talk about what I think freedom in the Republican sense requires in each of these areas. Traditionally, I should say Republicanism, as I really learned after the book Republicanism, I think from Quentin Skinner, really, in the first place, free personhood, free persons is really the central topic in the tradition rather than free choices. I think that's one of the things I think myself that shifted in the 17th century with someone like with Hobbes, for example. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about these in that order: free choices, persons, and societies, because I think nowadays any discussion of freedom, even the freedom of a person, has to start with the notion of free choice. In each of these areas, I think in philosophical theory of any kind, actually, but certainly here, there are two distinct sets of criteria that you want to meet in a decent theory. One I think of as conceptual or analytical criteria, which are any theory of any subject matter X, like it could be causation, it could be democracy, it could be free will indeed, it could be, of course, freedom, in our sense, social freedom. In each case, any such theory has got to match enough common assumptions about that topic in order for people to think, that's not a theory of freedom, that's a theory of something else. And that means it's got to satisfy some basic shared assumptions in the community that enables people to recognize this is a theory of X, of freedom in our case. That's the conceptual sort of criterion you need to satisfy. But there's also a substantive one, a theoretical one, if you wish, because I think that with any set of analytical assumptions, there are going to be a number of candidate properties that fit those assumptions, and therefore a number of candidate theories, all of which are satisfactory enough on conceptual terms. Like there are many different theories as we think of it, of, for example, democracy. So something else has to be done apart from finding a theory that is conceptually satisfactory. And what has to be done, I think, is, or what we all want to do, is to find a property or an entity that is really of significance, of substantive interest or importance in the relevant area of theorizing, whatever that is. And the theory you'll want to identify that, so to speak, candidate referent for the concept that's analytically satisfactory. So a theory of democracy, for example, I'll be sketching one later, is going to be a theory that satisfies general assumptions about what democracies are, but gives you a story about exactly what sort of institutions, according to this theory, are the best ways of promoting democracy in that sense. Okay, similarly with freedom, as we'll see. Okay, so to begin now with free choices, I think that there are a number of theories of social freedom, which are free choice in particular, which are all conceptually satisfactory. To be conceptually satisfactory, I think, is a theory of social freedom. To count as, yes, it's a theory of that topic. It's not changing the subject, so to speak. I think it's got to identify social freedom as something that's affected by hindrance of some sort from outside the subject who is rendered unfree by the presence of that hindrance. I think the hindrance that does render someone unfree by almost all accounts that I regard as sort of half plausible. All of these theories have to identify a hindrance that the subject themselves doesn't control. I mean, after all, if I control a hindrance, I've invited it, so to speak. It doesn't render me socially unfree. So it's got to be an external hindrance that I, as the subject rendered unfree by that hindrance, do not control in the relevant choice. And thirdly, I would say, and this is a more, as it were, controversial assumption, but it's just to pare down the range of theories I'm going to consider. I think a third sort of conceptual assumption is that no matter, even if the hindrance is welcome to the subject, if, so to speak, it's not controlled by the subject, it was, thanks be to heaven, it happened, it was a hindrance, but it did me good or suited me, that's also still going to render you unfree because you didn't control it. And similarly, it can be, so to speak, a morally just interference, but it still made you unfree. So that's the third sort of general assumption. So an external hindrance that is not controlled by a subject, even if it's welcome or morally correct, is still going to reduce the freedom in the relevant choice that is actually hindered. Now, I think there are three major families of theories that really satisfy all three of those assumptions. But they differ substantively. They differ in their account of what it is social freedom consists in. In fact, what they each do, and I'll try to explain that in a moment, what they each do is they play around with factors that the conceptual, as it were, correlating of a theory of freedom leaves open. And the factors are these. First of all, there's an issue as to whether or not I'm rendered unfree in a choice, but just a constraint that affects me from outside, or whether it has to be a case of my being subject to an alien control. That's a big divide, crucial divide, of course, from the point of view of anyone, I think, identifying with the Republican approach. But a second one is, well, wait a moment, whenever anyone's controlling me, they're in any case probably imposing a constraint. But the question then, whichever way you go on the first question, and the issue is whether that constraint, for example, has to prevent the taking of the choice, or whether it can merely make it more difficult, whether it can, for example, impose a penalty that makes it more costly to take the choice or makes it more difficult, whether it involves an interference with the knowledge of the subject so that it renders the choice, so to speak, harder to control from the subject's point of view. He's or she's misinformed. That's the second variable, constraint to control. And the constraint, is it preventative or can it just be, so to speak, softer than preventative? And a third variable is whether or not the constraint in question, however you think of it, whether it has to affect the choice that the subject wanted to take, the option in the choice that the subject wanted to take, or whether it's enough that any option in the choice was affected. And it's very interesting. You run these three and you get a nice matrix that I've set out on the handout, which I hope those equally who are, if there are any, who knows, listening to this virtually have access to that handout. But the three theories I think of as paradigmatic, and each of course can be varied in different ways. The first is a Hobbesian theory that says, first of all, any constraint on a choice is enough. It doesn't have to be one involving control from an alien subject or an alien will. Any constraint, even a physical constraint, is enough to render you unfree. But it has to be preventative constraint, he argues. It has to actually stop you taking an option, not just make it difficult or costly to take the option. And thirdly, he says, actually most telling me in a way, it has to be a preventive constraint that blocks the option you want to take, the preferred option. The fact that it stops you taking an option that you actually didn't want to take won't render you unfree. And then there's Berlin, the second sort of variation on this. Now, Hobbes, of course, just stands in for one family because, after all, you could be Hobbesian in some respects, but not in others. For example, you might think, yes, any external constraint, even though it's uncontrolling, does damage, even if it affects an unpreferred option. You can vary. It's a Hobbesian family, you might say, of theories. The Berlin approach is rather different. First of all, he is insistent that it's enough that any option be affected, not just the option that the agent prefers to take. He insists that it doesn't have to represent control by another person. At least he never says it does, and actually much of what he says suggests it doesn't. But he does think that the only forms of constraint, and they needn't be preventative either, they can just be ones that make the choice of an option more difficult. He thinks that any such form of constraint that's relevant has to be sourced in another human being. So you get a different on each of the three columns of variables, so to speak. He's with Hobbes that you don't need control from outside. A constraint is enough. He's against Hobbes in thinking that against Hobbes when Hobbes thinks that any external constraint is enough. He thinks no, only one starting with a human being. And thirdly, he thinks that where Hobbes really goes wrong, although curiously, he doesn't identify Hobbes as one person who defends this view, though manifestly he does. He thinks of Hobbes, or Hobbes I'm talking about, as going wrong in thinking that it's only the preferred option that's relevant. It's only if it is affected that there's a loss of freedom. And then there's a view which I hope you don't mind my calling it a neo-Republican view. I think probably a lot of us share it in any case, that says, look, you lose freedom in the paradigm case when you're controlled by from outside. And that in effect means by another agent. In practice, it means by an individual human agent, or it means by a corporate agent, of course, can control you in that way as well. But it suggests that any form of imposition of a controlling constraint, any form of constraint, it need not be preventative, is also going to diminish freedom of choice. And it's with Berlin, though, in arguing that it's important that any option in the choice may be affected and yet you lose your freedom. Now, I don't want to go through these in detail, of course, but cutting corners, so to speak, I think Berlin has a very nice objection to Hobbes, which knocks out the Hobbes theory. And I think many of the variations on the Hobbes theory, not all of them. And the argument is this. If you think it's enough that what you prefer is blocked, if you think that's enough for being made unfree, then of course you can make yourself free by changing what you want, by adapting your preferences. So a story I like to tell, you're in prison and you really want to live outside, and therefore in Hobbesian terms, you're really unfree. Your preferred option, living outside, is certainly blocked, actually prevented. But on the other hand, you realize, talking to a psychiatrist or therapist or social work or whatever, that, it's not so bad. And you think about it, you get a roof over your head, you can watch telly every now and then, it's true, you lights out very early and so on, and you want to get outside that. But, it's not so bad. The weather's pretty awful. It's winter and so on. If you bring yourself around to really, this is sort of what I want. Well, at that moment in the Hobbes theory, you become free, because now your preferred option, living in prison, after you've adapted your preferences, is not blocked in any way. I take that to be devastating, because any theory of social freedom that made it the case that you, by a bit of preference adaptation or therapy, could make yourself free is not really a theory that deserves to be called a theory of social freedom. Maybe it even fails the conceptual criteria, you might say. It certainly doesn't give us a substantively interesting sort of referent for the concept of social freedom. Now, that objection applies to any theory like Hobbes's that focuses on preferred option only. But there's also a problem with Berlin, which is that for all that Berlin officially says, I actually think there's some writings that suggest, he hadn't quite got in his explicit formulation of freedom all of the thoughts he actually found was sympathetic with. But on the official formulation, I can be rendered unfree. I will not be rendered unfree by existence of a controller in my life, provided the controller is perfectly nice and lets me choose as I wish. Berlin, you remember, characterizes his view of freedom as an open doors view of freedom. Each option is an open door. That's what's important. Whereas Hobbes said it just mattered that the door you pushed on, the door you preferred, the option you preferred, that it was open. Berlin argues, no, each option in the choice has to be open if you're really free. And of course, that's what's true of it's not the case that every option in the choice of the prisoner, even the prisoner who's undergone therapy that makes him or her like prison, it's not the case that every option is open. It's only the option he or she has come to prefer. However, for all he says, it doesn't matter if, to extend his metaphor, there's a doorkeeper there ready to slam the door in your face, should he or she just take against you. They don't like you, they have a change of mind, they maybe were, but, they've always got that power, and you live in the shadow of that power. Now, I think most of us feel, it's very hard to say that someone has freedom of speech if there's a big brother who allows them, likes them, lets them say what they wish or whatever. But actually, should big brother change their mind, then immediately, they're going to be stopped or liable to be stopped. to live in the shadow of that power, most of us feel, or that control, is not to be free. Now, that criticism applies to almost all variations of Hobbes and of Berlin that don't introduce control. And once you introduce control and say that in order to be free, it can't be the case that you're controlled by an outside force, then I think you've gone over to what I think of as the Republican camp. Let me just say one thing, especially with I see Alex Gurovich in the audience, which is that this is quite consistent, in my view, with recognizing that, of course, we can speak perfectly sensibly of structures or norms controlling how we behave. And it's perfectly right to think that they too can deprive us of freedom of choice. But I think that is because norms and structures of the kind that most people have in mind are ones that actually facilitate the domination by another person or will. So, for example, sexist norms, rightly, people say, control women in a way that makes them relatively unfree in relation to men. I say definitely yes, that's true. There's structural control or domination, as we call it. There's structural domination, but the structural domination is really objectionable because it facilitates agential control or agential domination, the control by another individual agent or group of agents or indeed a corporate agent. That's just an aside, so to speak. There are, as we know, it's a broad family, neo-republicanism, if that's what you want to call it. And obviously we each represent, or often each represent a rather different wing. I think those who emphasize structural domination are absolutely right to do so. But I do think that structural domination is to be understood by reference to interagential domination, as you might call it. Okay, so if you go along with these thoughts, then it seems reasonable to think that when it comes to free choice, the Republicans sort of, they've got a more, they're identifying a really important feature as what social freedom consists in. It consists in having a status such that you do not live under the control of another. The Romans called that sort of control suffered by a slave, a service in relation to a dominus, as dominatio. And they were quite clear that you could suffer dominatio and indeed lose libertas as a result, lose freedom, even if the master in question, the dominus in question, gave you carte blanche, as it were, let you behave just as you wished. Now, I think that notion of not being dominated in a choice, not being controlled from outside, is really, it identifies certainly a very important property that's likely to be important in any normative political theory, a significant property. And I think that not only does it, therefore, the theory of free choice is consisting in being able to make the choice in the absence of domination by another, or by structural domination indeed too. And the theory that says that's what free choice consists in has got a lot going for it. It is acceptable analytically or conceptually, and it identifies for us surely a very important property in social or normative or political theorizing. So let's move on to the notion of a free person. Now, freedom of choice, actually, even defined as I've given it, gives us an incredibly complex notion of freedom of choice, because, of course, you're now going to be free in a choice to the extent to which you're not dominated or controlled by another, the extent to which you don't live in the presence of a capacity on the part of another to control your choice. But of course, that capacity on the part of another could be a capacity that comes readily to them, or it could be one they can only, muster with difficulty in themselves. That's going to make a difference in the quality of the domination in the choice. But equally, it may be that the capacity is available to them at their discretion, just at their will, at their whim, or it may be that, it's only available to them under certain sort of constraints or circumstances. Again, that's going to make for a difference. And again, the capacity to interfere in that choice in this way, the capacity to dominate you, to control the choice, maybe something available to them just opportunistically, contingently, like the mugger in the park, sees his or her chance, to mug you. They've temporarily, very non-enduringly, got the power of controlling your choice in a case like that. And clearly you're rendered unfree just by having to walk a bus, the car park in their presence, I would say. And of course, that's made worse if they actually exercise the capacity. And that contrasts with, say, the way in which a corporation might have dominating power over the individuals employed by it, or perhaps over its consumers, customers, or indeed over those who live in the community where it operates. So the whole range I've mentioned in the handout of dimensions in which freedom of choice, understood in the Republican way, can vary enough to make you almost throw up your hands in vain and say, gee, how do you measure the freedom of choice understood in that way? Now, I think that actually has really concerned quite a lot of people, like Ian Carter and Matthew Kramer, for example, who insist on wanting a notion of free choice so you can measure it, measure how much of it there is going around, so to speak, to make it into like utility or wealth or whatever, almost like GDP, to make it into something we could measure societies by. I sort of feel that actually it's a hopeless venture because there are so many dimensions. If you understand freedom of choice in what I think is the more interesting way, the Republican way, and I sort of despair of getting any sort of metric. But that doesn't lead me to despair, period. After all, I said that in the Republican tradition, the focus has always been on what it is to be a free person. In the Roman tradition, what it is to be a liber, a liber, as in liber is free is an adjective, but it's also a liber is the free subject. In 17th century England, it was the freeman, that is somebody who has that status. Sorry that it's masculinist, but it was in that usage. I mean, in America, where we're speaking at the moment, the United States, the idea of we the people was a notion of we were speaking as equally free subjects. Of course, in all of these countries, it should be said, including, alas, the United States of that period, the we was always relatively contained. Let's use the word citizenry for those who were, in that sense, thought to be free persons, because women weren't included in general at any rate, but equally, there were, of course, actual slaves in America of the 1700s. And in all of these earlier cases, there were lots of men as well as women excluded from citizenship. But if you'll allow me, let me just focus on citizens. In this notion of the free person or the free citizen, the emphasis was, and you find it wonderfully rich in someone like Milton writing about republicanism in the 17th century, was on someone who can walk tall, and not be embarrassed and not have to call people by fancy names or whatever, not have to bend the knee, or fawn or curry, toady or fawn, curry favor. All of that language arose in the 17th century when republicanism was à la mode in England of the time, generating that language, which carried over also into Republican language, I think, of 18th century America. Now, what is this notion of a free person? Let me explain now why I think it can offer us the guiding thread in thinking about social freedom. Well, the main thing to say about the free person in the tradition of the free citizen was that the free person was assumed to be equal with other such free persons. So equality was right in there at the beginning. The notion of a liber, as Cicero actually says, equalitas, equitas, and libertas, are like that. As Rousseau says it nearly 2,000 years later, it's always been a theme. But the free person in particular is someone who's equally free with others. Now, let's take that as the key. What would it mean to make a person equally free with others? Well, if you start from free choice, as I've done, you're going to want to say, it seems to me, something like this, that first of all, it should give people the same range of choices, the same breadth, so to speak, of freedom, the same range of choices in which they are each free. And secondly, this is a matter of depth rather than breadth. It should protect people so far as possible equally in the exercise of those choices. So you need, in order to get from the notion of free choice to the notion of free person, you need a notion of the breadth or range of choices covered and the depth of protection provided for those choices. Remember, protection is essential because protection is part of what constitutes freedom. Protection is essential because, after all, to be free in this account is not to have to live under the power of another. And protection is precisely what blocks the power of others and gives you a space in which, so to speak, you can not be dominated. You can be free in the sense of non-domination. Okay, so you need an account in the free person of what is the breadth of choice that's relevant, what is the depth of choice. Now, of course, that's still a very challenging sort of idea. And what I think is probably the most useful thing to do is you won't get a quantitative metric, I think, of any kind of the sort that people interested in measuring free choice are looking for. But I think what we do have is a very intuitive idea that has got a cutting edge. We all understand it, I think was I presented, and it does connect nicely with the tradition. And that is to say, look, people enjoy a sufficient breadth of free choice and a sufficient depth of free choice, a sufficient range of choices in which they are free, and sufficient protection in each of those choices, to the extent to which what's provided enables them to be able to look others in the eye, in that, I know, culturally specific metaphor, to look others in the eye without a reason for fear or for deference. I think that eyeball test, as I tend to call it, it's implicit in a lot of long tradition, and it gives you a now working sense of what it would be for a person to be free in a society. They mightn't be as wealthy as everybody else or as some people around them, but there's enough protection available to them to be able to look that person in the eye, not to have reason for fear or deference based on the asymmetrical power of that person to interfere with them in one of the protected choices. Okay, just to go on a little bit from that. So what would be the range of choices that you'd expect to be encompassed under the eyeball test? And I think it's answers to a notion introduced in 17th century Republican thought, that of the fundamental liberties or the basic liberties. And those are choices such that it is conceivable, it is possible for everybody to enjoy them, even while other people are enjoying them. It isn't the case that, so to speak, they're inherently competitive. So, for example, just taking possession of anything you want the use of, well, that's inherently competitive. You know, not everybody can enjoy that liberty. And so a liberty they can enjoy would be a liberty that is carved out, so to speak, under property conventions or rules. Now, of course, this is a very touchy subject because property conventions or rules can themselves favor some over others. That's pretty manifest. But in principle, the idea of property rules, rules of ownership, rules of trade, and so on, rules of titles of ownership, rights of ownership, that in principle you can think of as we design them or should design them so that we identify a liberty of ownership, liberty of trade, and so on, such that in principle everybody can enjoy that, in principle. But the same is going to be true for, you know, freedom of speech. Well, as Herbert Hart actually said famously in a critique of roles, when he gave a lecture on this topic, he said, you're in front of an audience and we all enjoy freedom of speech. But if we each just choose to speak at the same time, well, we may manage to do that, but it may be co-exercisable, that choice, but it isn't co-enjoyable. You know, the point of speech will be undermined if all of us are speaking at the same time. And so what you would need to do is carve out the liberty of freedom of speech in an assembly of that kind under a rule, now not property rules, but rules like he said, Robert's Rules of Order. Under Robert's Rules of Order, everybody can have the same freedom to speak out in an assembly. Without those rules, in a phrase of Berlin's, artificially carving out, the liberty in question, you're not really going to be able to have equal enjoyment of that freedom. And the idea is that we should, in our, if we're going to have a notion of free person, we should be able to identify the choices of that kind that should be available to everybody, and we should provide enough protection for them to be able to pass the eyeball test. That's a topic maybe come back to in the discussion, but for fear of running out of time, I better push on towards free societies. Okay, so we have a notion of freedom and a choice, very hard to measure. We have a notion of freedom of persons, and two people may be equally free persons in the sense of being able to look others in the eye without reason for fear or deference, with some variation in the freedom of their choices as measured by the metrics that I mentioned there, so long as whatever variation that's there is consistent with their each being able to satisfy the eyeball test, then they have a sufficient breadth of choice, I would say, and a sufficient depth of freedom and choice. But now, what is a free society going to be? Well, presumably a free society is going to be a society that provides for those who are citizens of the society, ideally, of course, for all of us, very inclusive citizenry. In the tradition, historically, not an inclusive citizenry, but that doesn't deny us access to this way of thinking, because it can generalize to an inclusive citizenry. In the traditional notion of a republic, though, and in all Republican notions, I think, the idea of a free society, a free state, is a society that enables people to be free persons, which requires that they should have the same sort of depth of protection and the same breadth of choice, and at least to the extent to which that will show up in their being able to pass the eyeball test. Okay, so what would that involve? Well, for a society to do that, obviously you need law, because you'll need law, in, again, Berlin's phrase, to artificially carve out the choices that are going to be protected as fundamental or basic liberties or choices. And it's hard to see how you could ever do that unless there are accepted norms and ideally accepted laws, norms that are recognized in common and where there is some way of applying them, regulating them, questioning them, interrogating them, and settling the disputes. So I think you need a set of norms and laws that will define the basic liberties, that's for sure. But of course, you might have a nice set of basic liberties defined by the law and so on, and people not enjoy full protection in the exercise of these common liberties or choices. And that wouldn't be good enough by our account. So the society would also have to provide for the defense of individual people's freedom of choice in those basic liberties, their defense, their protection, their defense against the control of any other individual or any corporate body, for example. Okay, and that means, of course, that the law again is going to be, in all likelihood, it's the only possible way of doing it, that the law actually doesn't just define the basic liberties, but defends the basic liberties. Now, of course, you might say, well, one strong individual, the benevolent despot, could do the protection, right? But in the Republican tradition, it's pointed out, of course, if you have a benevolent despot, or even a benevolent elite or corporate body, then, of course, the fact that people are protected against one another, the fact that they enjoy, as you might call it, private non-domination, or against the corporations they form amongst themselves, that's consistent with this benevolent despot being able to change the rules overnight if he or she wished. And so everyone will live under the power of that despot. And so you need a story about how the controller of the law is not going to be himself or herself or itself a dominator of the very people who live under the law. That's always argued against the benevolent despot idea in favor of a notion of a law that is controlled by the people who live under it and that is not controlled by someone who might represent an alien form of domination over all of them equally, or perhaps over only some of them, a subsection. And that's what we want in a free society. We want a law that will both define and suitably defend the exercise of the basic liberties. Okay, and insofar as it would provide protection against the very source of the lawmaker, as it were, those who make and impose the law, it would guard against not just the private domination of individual by individual or private corporation of individuals, it would also guard against public domination by the source of the law, by the, let's use the word, the sovereign body or whatever it is. Okay, so now I think that this means that the very Republican idea of freedom, especially freedom of person, points us towards an ideal of a free society. And this is actually, I think, why ultimately the property it identifies as what social freedom consists in is a significant property, satisfying the substantive criterion or desideratum I set out at the beginning, because such a society equipped to deliver people this sort of breadth and depth of free choice, equipped to make and keep them at least as free persons, is surely going to count in most terms as a just society. And I want to say there are going to be two dimensions to justice within this society on the Republican way of keeping the books. I'm setting aside global justice, which is another topic, and I think equally that the approach suggests very strong lines of thought about that, and no doubt we'll have papers on that within the Republican Handbook of Republicanism that Frank and Tim are editing. But I'm going to set that aside. The two dimensions of justice, the domestic justice, so to speak, that are important to distinguish are what I call social justice and political justice, or if you like, democratic justice. Now, what social justice ought to deliver is sufficiently wide, broad, and deep protection for individuals in their life within the society against private individuals and private bodies. It's a big ask, so to speak. Now, what might law do in order to achieve this? Well, we all have views on this, and I think working out the Republican theory of social justice, I'll come to political justice in a moment, is really a terrifically challenging sort of research program. I think Frank Lovett and I, when we wrote that Annals of Political Science article on the Republican sort of approach, over 10 years ago now, we described it as a research program. And this really is why I think of it as a research program. It's not just an abstract theory of freedom. You take it, swallow it, and go home. No, it's a theory of freedom that directs you towards ways of thinking about how we might better achieve freedom in that sense, especially making our societies into free societies. Now, just very briefly, I'm just on the 40 minutes, I believe, so I'll take just a few minutes more. Very briefly, I think of social justice as requiring a number of different things. It's certainly going to require that the law enables those who, for reasons of disability, for reasons of ill luck, for reasons of, the lottery, going against the genetic lottery or whatever, really aren't in a position to exercise or enjoy the basic liberties. So I think a first requirement is that the law should, in that sense, empower people against disadvantage of that kind. Otherwise, they are not going to be free persons. They're not going to get to first base, so to speak. But apart from just enabling people to access basic choices in that way, the law should protect people in the basic choices, basic liberties that they can access. And of course, that protection can take many different forms. I mention a variety of forms just as a taxonomy to lead us into thinking about it. You can have the law generally protects people and directly protects people insofar as there's a criminal justice law, for example. Of course, we all have views. Actually, the first work I did of a Republican character was with John Braithwaite, a philosopher come criminologist. Actually, if you know John, come everything else you can think of. I mean, he's an extraordinary polymath. John and I wrote a book called Not Just Desserts in 1990, which was subtitled Republican Theory of Criminal Justice, because we were trying to work this out. So criminal justice system, we certainly need one. Certainly not like the one we have. And John's strongly associated, partly as a result of that work, partly later, with the restorative justice movement. There's lots of room in all of these areas for reform and overthrow, really, of existing systems. That's direct general protection. But there's also general but indirect protection, as in the law of tort or law of contract. Gives us each certain powers, against other people who might be damaging us in a way that redounds badly on our basic liberties. And by giving us those powers, which can be litigated in court, I think that's quite important. I mean, I'm not thinking of just the individual, who takes a grievance to court, who maybe has to be fairly wealthy or influential to be able to do that. I'm also thinking of class action. And one of the really sorry things about recent developments is the extent to which companies have introduced these so-called arbitration clauses with consumers and with employers that block class action. Because, boy, that's a really important power that people have had and has been denied them in recent times. But equally, there's more specific protection, and it comes in direct and indirect forms as well. Specific protection of those in positions which, for all sorts of independent reasons, make them relatively vulnerable. Often women in marriages or employees in various forms of employment. And I think that workplace law, domestic law, laws against domestic abuse, all of these are really important in dealing with that problem. But there's also indirect empowerment or protection in these areas, like unionization. I mean, this is a topic dear to Alex Gorovich's heart, as I know in his recent work, and really important. I mean, as I've felt right back to Republicanism, unions are really, really important in order to fight power with power. Corporations represent the union of often investors and shareholders. Why can't the workers, so to speak, operate collectively as well, or corporately, in making their demands? No, they're picked off one by one. I mean, where on earth does that come from? So I would say indirect protection or divorce, for example, divorce at will is a very powerful form of indirect protection in marriage. Okay, I think there are various accounts of what social justice might. That's just a rough taxonomy. When it comes to political justice, this is really vertical justice versus horizontal. Horizontal justice is enjoying justice, being free persons in relation to other persons and other private bodies, so to speak, on your level. Vertical justice would be where you've got control over the controllers who dictate the laws, i.e. over the state, over the government in power at any one time. Now, of course, you might think the people themselves could rule. And that was what Rousseau thought. Otherwise, I would say very faithful to the Republican tradition, certainly in how he thought about freedom. But he thought you had to have a single sovereign and could only be a constituent assembly of all the citizens. I think that's probably infeasible for all sorts of reasons, and maybe many of you will agree, but some will not. I think if you have an independent government, as I think you more or less have to have, and you want people to control, though, what they're doing in laying down the law upon us, then you have to resort to other mechanisms. I should say, by way of background, I don't think anybody is dominated or controlled just by virtue of the fact of having to live with other people and not being able to dictate the law themselves they live under. That's just part of the human condition. I don't think anybody is dominated by the fact that they have to accept that they're not special, and that if they're going to be protected by the state in its laws against others, so others could equally expect to be treated the same as they want to be treated. That normative principle is equally not a source of domination. I think, though, if you accept that they're more or less, I think also the very existence of the state doesn't create domination. It's a historical, functional necessity, in my view. We're stuck with it if you like. Maybe it would be a much better universe if states not emerged. They have emerged. I think myself, we're stuck with them. In any case, I think it's more realistic to assume we're stuck with them and then look for political justice against the background of that assumption, rather than being ideal theoretic and asking about how we might deal without the state. But how do you control? Well, I think it's the way I happen to think about it, but again, lots of variation. People have got to have control of various kinds, ordinary people. And they share, it's okay that they share equally in a system of control. Now, Sean Ingram is here. He's got other ideas not to do this, and lots of other people have other ideas not to do this. So this is just my idea. I think the people have got to have control over the constitution under which government is formed, over which it's determined who is to govern and how they're to govern, under what procedures. That has to be, in a certain way, subject to people's control. But equally, I think that under the Constitution, you see, you could have a constitution that people could overthrow in a referendum or whatever, that just establishes one person as in an elected king, as we've had those in the past. And under the Constitution, the people equally, I think, have to have a lot of what I call operational control. They will have that indirectly via statutory officers in the tradition of the mixed constitution, but they have to have it directly as well. And this is where I've always thought that contestation is the name of the game. And I'm sometimes painted by John McCormack and some others as being an aristocratic Republican, because I don't go for the more radical views that they take. It seems to me that's a difference in institutional design rather than a difference in theory. But I do, like them, emphasize the importance of popular contestation and people having. Now, they happen to believe, and that's absolutely worth discussing. I'm not expert in these areas, that a system of popular assemblies with a tribunate like you had in ancient Rome would be a better system. And maybe it would be. I'm just suggesting people have to have some operational control under the system over how government is behaving. That, of course, requires freedom of information, and all the rest of it. Thirdly, though, people have to enjoy, I would say, selectional control. That is to say, control over who gets into office. Now, I think offices in general divide into domain general and domain specific offices. Domain general are basically those in the legislature and the head of the executive, where they don't have a brief, so to speak, as to what they are to do. I think the best control that I know of is still election, open, periodic elections accepted by both sides. Need I emphasize that in this context or in this time? I think that they're really crucial. It's not because I think elections select the best people. I think the Federalist Papers went badly wrong on that. Elections do not select the best people in general, I would say. But gee, it's really important we have them, because it's the only way in which we do control, at least one dimension of control over those in power. Of course, domain-specific offices like the courts, for example, or various statutory bodies, maybe the central bank, the Fed, for example. Bodies like this, they're not elected to, and I think they shouldn't be for all sorts of reasons I won't go into now. But I think the appointment of those offices has to be under conditions of transparency, and those in the offices have to be subject to constraints that answer to what people generally find acceptable. Let's just give an image of political justice and what it requires. The free society has to be socially just and politically just. It has to ensure the horizontal justice of each being able to walk tall in relation to others. But it also has to ensure vertical or political justice in having a form of government such that those in power are not in a position to lord it over us. They are servants of the people, as it were, not masters of the people. Okay, so that's it. I'm certainly a dyed-in-the-wool, signed-up Republican in the sense of thinking this is a really acceptable and deeply interesting way of thinking about freedom. I think it applies at the level of free choice, free person, and free society. I think it delivers us a fairly good base on which to think about issues of justice. And finally, I think it offers us a nice alternative to what I think of as the two very popular ideologies of today, neoliberalism and neopopulism. Neoliberalism, because neoliberalism, remember, is very hostile to law. All law takes from liberty, after all, in the sense of non-interference. It always interferes, and are very in favor of the market, suggesting that that's all contractual and there's no interference, really. Now, again, Bob Taylor is in the audience, Robert Taylor, and I have to also acknowledge that we're a broad family, and he will have a different view on this. But I think of neoliberalism as offering a view of freedom where it doesn't depend on law, where rather law is hostile as such. It should be needed, but only as a last recourse, so to speak. They favor a night watchman state, as you might call it. Now, I think that if you realize that freedom depends on law constitutively to provide the depth and indeed define the breadth of protection for free persons, you're going to join with Kant and Locke and a venerable tradition in seeing law as introductive of freedom rather than coercive of freedom. With neopopulism, again, I see it as representing the idea the only way you can control those in government is by election. And that means those in government have to be those elected, ideally the one leader or the leading party. Of course, it goes through all sorts of warping distortions after that, as we know, with the people being defined as the real people in front, favoring the leader as the real leader and so on, but putting that aside. This approach suggests, I think, on almost any version, that there must be multiple controls over government. It can't be just electoral. I better stop there. Thank you very much. I've overshot my time by 5 minutes, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Pettit, for those fascinating and insightful remarks. And we have some time for questions. And I just want to explain a little bit about the questions, because we actually have had, I think, quite a few people who are watching us on Zoom, and we want to give them the opportunity to ask questions too. So the way the questions will work is we have two people watching for questions. Rachel is watching the internal audience, and Ellen is watching the external audience. And if the internal audience is called upon, Rachel will give you a mic so that the external audience can hear what you say. And similarly, when the external audience comes in, if we're able to make it happen, the person will suddenly appear behind me, big face, and will ask their question. So that's what we're going to attempt. And I now give the floor back to Professor Pettit, but I'm going to point at people. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll point at you, and then you'll become... Okay. I'm just going to stand here for the purpose of calling on someone. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bob Taylor, UC Davis. So just a question about theories of free choice, and especially that space inclusive between Berlin and Republicanism. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about where Rawls fits in that space. And the reason I'm asking the question is that in your earlier work, you tended to lump Rawls in with Berlin, and not without reason. But in Just Freedom in particular, you start suggesting that maybe Rawls occupies, I don't know, an in-between space, comes closer to Republicanism, and you say similar things about constitutional liberals in general. So I'm wondering what your position is at this point in time about Rawls and where he would fit in that space.
I think I was rather too simple about Rawls in some of my earlier comments, and various people have called me to book reasonably about it. However, that said, if you peer through Rawls's texts and what he says about liberty, he often says very nice things about Berlin, by the way, and quotes him, for example, in favoring a notion of liberty that distinguishes it from capacity. That's maybe incidental now to her. My view of Rawls still, I guess, is this. Rawls works with what I think of as a less demanding notion of freedom as non-interference, which is what begins really, there are anticipations of it in Hobbes, but I think the real origin of it is Bentham, who actually wrote to complain to someone back in 1776 that he'd been citing a view of freedom according to which it just means no restraint, no constraint. Then you've got a free choice, and under which law itself is a constraint and therefore, to that extent, removes freedom. I think that Rawls, along with Berlin, still goes along with that notion of freedom. But of course, he's very much on towards the left. And he compensates, so to speak, for the undemanding quality of what freedom requires by having the second principle, the principle basically of equality, the difference principle. Now, that means you've got two sorts of theories. You've got the Republican theory that has a single axiom, as it were. Freedom is non-domination, at least as I think of it, but passing out in the way I've tried to explain, I think, in this lecture. And it generates a whole theory of social justice and political justice. I think what Rawls does is, from the combination of a concern with liberty in the thinner sense, together with socioeconomic equality, he certainly reaches a view of social justice that is in the same family as the view that I tend, in my reading of neo-republicanism, to favor. He has surprisingly little to say about political justice. It's one of my complaints, especially about the later work. There's more later, but it's never full-blooded. It's never quite clear. So I guess that's all I should say, because there are other questions.
Hi, Sean Ingham from UC San Diego. I was curious how you reconcile two statements that you made tonight. One was the admission that there could be a role for something like a citizens' assembly of the kind that McCormick advocates, and the other is the statement.
John, could you remove the mask? It makes it
interfering with
very hard to, yeah.
So the question is about how one reconciles two statements that you made tonight. One is the admission that there could be a role for a citizens' assembly in a republic. One is your acknowledgement that there could be a role for a citizens' assembly of the kind that McCormick advocates in a well-designed republic. And the other is the claim that the citizens ought to have selectional control over those in office, because it seems like a natural way of describing what a citizens' assembly is a mechanism for selecting office holders by random lottery, such that nobody has control over who ends up becoming an office holder. Yeah.
Well, I think of the full assembly proposal. After all, it was invented first by Baudin and then Hobbes, and taken over and, as it were, straightened up and polished off and laundered by Rousseau as a mode of government of which the people will all come together in assembly and then vote by majority voting on what was to be done in a whole series of issues. All of those writers, first of all, they ignore the infeasibility of the Rousseau admits it and similarly limits it to not France, but to basically Geneva. But the others ignore it, the size infeasibility. But there's another infeasibility, which is that it offers no protection against a series of inconsistent judgments being made over time, if it's just bottom-up majority voting. I think for these reasons that the notion of an assembly of all the citizens voting on everything is not realistic. Might there be a lottery type version of it? I mean, certainly worth thinking about, under which you get a body like that, which is not plenary, but if you just select it on the basis of lot, in the way in which we select citizens' assemblies, which I think are really very important myself nowadays. Could we do that? Well, again, there's really room for institutional modeling here. Myself, I'm sort of not so optimistic really about that. But then Alex Guerrero has a book coming out, and I'm sure that will meet a lot of the objections that I'm not being inclined to put to it. There's your own proposal, which I think is worth further scrutiny. I'm sorry if I haven't talked about it here, which involves a rather different appeal to, obviously, the voice of the majority, but I think evades a lot of the problems I've raised. When it comes to which is best, as I've tried to stress, I think there's room for, and that's why Frank and I think of Republicanism as a research program. There's really room for looking at these institutional proposals, these different proposals, and seeking to evaluate them, model them, see where they would go, see how they compare with, others on various sorts of desiderata. That's work that really, I applaud you for doing that sort of work, and various other people. And I certainly do not mean to suggest that what I said is the one and only way of doing it, where you've got a government that are elected and then subjected to these other controls, the operational controls, as well as the electoral controls. And of course, the constitutional controls, where the Constitution is itself, perhaps with the citizen-initiated referendum arrangement, subject to the control of the people.
Thank you very much for that lecture, Philip. Since I'm also seated in the peanut gallery over here, I thought I'd also ask a question. So I really appreciated the discussion of freedom as something that's socially constituted, and that the free person is a free person in virtue of the way in which we institute certain relationships. But I wonder how much you think that Republicans are also committed not just to the intersubjective constitution of freedom, but to the intersubjective constitution of the kind of person who values freedom. Is Republicanism a theory that's only appropriate to a society where most or everyone highly or centrally values that freedom? Is the role of these institutions also to cultivate that valuing of it, as well as the development of certain kinds of capacities, such that we're not just talking about the intersubjective constitution of freedom, but also of the person itself? Or is Republicanism rather more neutral in your view regarding that question?
Okay, great question, Alex. This is Alex Gurevich, by the way, for the people may not know who you are. I think that if you are going to promote freedom in the Republican sense, make persons equally free in the appropriate sense, then of course, you're really not going to manage to do that very well unless people develop a sense of the value of that very freedom. So that you have to, as it were, reach people's minds and hearts, as well as just controlling their behavior, defending them as if, they didn't understand what was happening. I think that's really important. It's like Rawls is very sensitive to that in his theory of justice, with this discussion of how the institutions he thinks of as just would elicit a sense of justice in people. And now, I would hope that institutions of the kind that we might sort of roughly converge on as worthwhile and, useful institutionally for the motion of freedom, would equally elicit a sense, so to speak, of the value of freedom. But I think it needs more than that. I think there is room for, so to speak, a rhetoric of freedom. People need, vivid image of what it is. That's one of the things I like about republicanism. And Jose Marti and I, in our book about Zapatero's Spain, emphasized in particular the importance of getting people, so to speak, to be enthused about the idea, getting them to understand what it was to walk tall, getting them to understand that having a union in your workplace, if you're an employer, doesn't mean you're, bossed around, but it's the penalty, the cost you pay for your workers enjoying something like the sort of power and status that you enjoy. Equality of that kind, I think, ought to be appealing. Actually, when I mentioned that, I do think that Zapatero was prime minister in Spain, or president, as he's called there. I think he was a wonderful example of that. He took the notion of no dominación, no domination, as the great catch cry. And it really caught on in Spain at the time. He used it, for example, to persuade the Spanish parliament and ultimately the Spanish people, ultimately even his own party, to support same-sex marriage, for example. Spain, traditionally very conservative Catholic country, was the third legislature in the world to support same-sex marriage. And he did it in terms of appealing to the eyeball test. He actually said to people in the parliament, which of you is able to, will expect someone who's homosexual, if you're heterosexual, to be able to look you in the eyes and equal if you're saying your intimate relationships are not worthy of the same public recognition and protection as mine. I mean, it was a very, very telling. And he brought, there was minority support in the party, I understand, certainly amongst the people. There was deep hostility in some areas to the idea of same-sex marriage, but he won them around, as he also used it a lot in defending women's rights. I mean, if I can just be personal, I remember sitting across the table from him on one occasion. I was not an advisor, but I was writing this review at his request of his government. And he pounded the table and said to me, "Who are the most dominated people in the world?" And, I said, as does with the prime minister, we don't meet people like that all that often in our profession. He said, women, because he was really insistent. And I think it led to, but it caught on for a time. Then unfortunately, the dark cloud of the great financial crisis, descended on Spain particularly harshly. Not for reasons of misgovernment, it must be said, at the level of national government, but for all sorts of other reasons.
So I think we have time for one last question, and we have a question from the. We have time for two questions. One of which will be from one of our people who is actually watching online. So we're hoping to bring them onto the screen, and after that, Richard Dagger, and after that, reception. Professor, so this relates to what your remarks you just made. Professor Jose Marti has actually has an interjection, but we have to get him visible for him to be able to interject.
Oh, there we are. Good.
Not yet.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Wonderful.
Hello, everyone. This is Jose Marti from Barcelona, Pompeu Fabra University. I was actually thinking in asking these questions before Philip mentioned Zapatero, and the question is not related to Zapatero, but I can confirm that everything he said is totally right. And actually, I saw Zapatero today. I mean, it's just a coincidence, but I saw him in a presentation of a book, and he also insisted in this idea that women are the most dominated collective across history. But my question relates the notion of political justice that you just presented, Philip. And I know, what you have said, and you can read in the handout, and you have defended also in your writings. I know that you think that in order for this political justice to be obtained, you need the people to have the ultimate control, right? And then you have presented and defended this story about the importance of having electional control and having constitutional control. But let me use the example of same-sex marriage as a test for what you're saying, because I think when you insist in contestation, which I totally agree, contestation is absolutely key for any democracy. You need rights of protest and rights of mobilization and freedom of expression and so on. But even if that is key, my worry if that is enough, if that is sufficient. And let me test what I'm saying with a question. So imagine that the majority of Spaniards were not in favor of same-sex marriage, despite Zapatero's will that this should be passed as a law by the legislature. But imagine that across time, systematically, consistently, the Spanish citizens, they refuse same-sex marriage. I guess what a Republican should say, and just, really asking you what you think, but I guess that what you might say is that you need mechanisms to exercise this kind of constitutional control in a way that you might allow the people to impose, right, their ultimate will on any other person, including the prime minister, even if the prime minister might be right. We probably, many of us think that he was right in defending this. But even if the people is wrong, giving them the ultimate control means that you need to face the chance that they might impose wrong decisions, and that you need effective mechanisms for them to impose those decisions. So my worry is that what I can see in our societies is that I don't see sufficient mechanisms for the people to impose their will over time. So I would like to hear more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. I'm afraid he's gone. You put your finger on what I think is a really deep tension I think it's a tension that any theory of justice must actually face. And I think it becomes particularly sharp when you distinguish between social justice and political justice, as I do. And that is, so political justice would require, so to speak, that the people on not all matters, because on some matters, I think things should be taken off the electoral agenda, so to speak, where it's clear that there are sticky minorities that may be subject to majoritarian dominating will being always in the minority. Now, it may be that you think the matter of same-sex marriage should be like that. There should be constitutional rights, so to speak. So mere election wouldn't deprive people of the right of same-sex marriage. It would take a constitutional amendment, which would be much harder to achieve. But putting that aside, suppose you think that it is an issue that ought not to be, in that sense, constitutionalized, insulated against electoral influence. I think then you've got to bite the bullet. You've got to decide which is more important. Social justice, as I conceive of it, which in this case, of course, would be availability of same-sex marriage, or political justice, meaning that on an issue like this, where you get as you described it, a vast majority taking the other view, political justice would presumably require, I mean, there's something more to say, but let's say presumably require that government should be responsive to that sort of deep-laid judgment amongst the people. So which is the more important, social justice against the people's will, as it were, or political justice leading to social injustice? I have to say, and it's something that I've sort of wrestled with over quite a number of years. For example, on the People's Terms, 2012, I think I left the issue high and dry. I now feel rather strongly that political justice is the primary one, partly because if you've got a politically unjust system with socially just laws, for example, the colonial system might introduce socially very just laws, but be politically unjust, actually being colonial. The trouble there is that there's no way you can be sure that the colonial judgment will remain, governor will remain socially just. So you're really subject to great instability. If, on the other hand, you have a politically just system, let's say a rich democracy, where you've got a socially unjust law, well, then you have a possibility of improvement. You know, you can get to a much better place, presumably, if you get, going back to this issue, enough appreciation of the value of freedom, and in particular, its being accessible to those of a different sexual orientation, for example, from the majority. So I think political justice actually comes first in a case like that, assuming that it's not something worthy of being constitutionalized, which in this particular example, I think it may be worthy of being constitutionally protected.
Our final question, Professor Dagger.
Thank you. Richard Dagger, University of Richmond. Juxtaposing what you say about the analytical element of free choices, freedom is to be, your concern, a free choice must take that freedom is affected by external hindrance, not internal hindrance. And thinking of that in terms of the eyeball test, which I've found a very powerful metaphor ever since you first introduced it, I think. But I've also found that some people who don't seem to be able to look others in the eye for no reason that could be traced to any kind of social domination. It's not Nora and Torvald, but maybe it's somebody who's autistic, who has some kind of what I would think of as probably an internal hindrance to freedom. Is that something that is not germane here? Or is that beyond the scope of republicanism or what?
Well, it's certainly, I think that's worth discussing. I think there are three cases where the eyeball test, as it were, might not apply, even though there is, so to speak, let's assume, a perfectly good socially just and politically just society. One is a case where you're dealing with a culture. If there are cultures, as we're assured there are some, sometimes people say it about some Aboriginal peoples in Australia, although I must say I'm not totally convinced. If there's a culture where looking in the eye, so to speak, is just not something you do, it's brazen or it's hostile or whatever it might be. I mean, I'm just going to say in that case, I'm using a locally specific metaphor to communicate something that is still going to carry a message in that sort of society. As in, they may not look one another in the eye, but they know what it is to enjoy status vis-a-vis others, such that you don't have a reason for fear or deference, for example. Second case is the one you mentioned, like where people are disabled in various ways. You mentioned autistic people are not able to look you in the eye. I mean, there is a problem with the range of disabilities as to how far people can be incorporated within the community as full citizens. My own sort of preference is for maximal, as we're assuming that they are able-minded and able in that way. But if you judge not, still they should have protections that maximally resemble the protections that someone fully able-minded would have. Now, in the case of the autistic person, of course, we know that the autistic condition is a very wide spectrum, from people who literally can't manage on their own to people who not only can manage, but do extraordinarily well, being gifted in all sorts of ways. So it's a hard issue to address. And of course, it's going to rise differently in all of those cases. The disability case in general is always difficult for any theory of justice. I think that what I'm talking about here is the theory of general justice, assuming there aren't serious disabilities of that kind. I mean, disabilities of mind, as you might call them. But there's room for a special theory of justice that would be ancillary to that and would deal with these more specific issues arising with people in that camp, as it were. The third sort of case, of course, is someone who's just out of timidity. They're perfectly well protected, but they just can't bring themselves to look the boss in the eye, like the employee in that wonderful New Yorker cartoon where the employer leans across the desk as he's sitting in the chair, huddled in front of him. He says, "Jones, they tell me you respond very well to intimidation." I mean, you can imagine somebody responding very well, all too well to intimidation, even in a world where they're totally well protected, for example. I think that the enjoyment of freedom as non-domination is an ethical challenge. You've got a right to it, and the person who's suffering that sort of timidity, the only one who can solve that problem is they themselves, probably, or maybe their therapist, as it were. But it's not a problem the state can solve. It's not a problem the law can solve. So it's out, in that sense, it's beyond the ballpark of our considerations today.
Thank you very much, Professor Pettit, for that wonderful lecture, those and very stimulating responses to questions as well. I want to thank the audience for their questions. First of all, the audience here for being here, but also the audience from all over the world, and particularly places such as Spain, as we saw, that are 6 hours distant. So it's after midnight, and it's wonderful that you were able to be present. I want to remind everybody that tomorrow at 9:30 in the morning, United States time, East Coast United States time. Professor Quentin Skinner will be giving the John Sumner Steed lecture in very much the same circumstances as the lecture we heard tonight. And I invite you all also to attend that lecture. So thank you very much, Professor Pettit. This has been a wonderful Elkins lecture. And those of you who are in the room are invited to a reception starting now.